again, and welcome to the 293rd consecutive presentation of Forum for a Better Understanding. You know, one of the very special treasures that I have of being this host is to have exceptional guests who sometimes even come back. And one of our guests is present here, who has been here 3 times before in Fresno for different occasions. Her name is Kathy Kelly. You may know her as a 3-time Nobel Prize nominee, or you may know that she has been one of those people that since 1996 has been visiting and going back to the Middle East, to Iraq especially, 24 times, to be able to keep in touch with what has gone on there. In the last 7 years of war, we have not been just accepting this, at least certain people have not. They have been not only visiting, but campaigning and crusading, speaking and working for an alternative to war in our world as standard operating procedure, as something we have to get used to. Kathy, it's so great to have you and Voices for Creative Nonviolence as an alternative to what is standard fare. You were here giving a keynote at the Festival for Peace and Justice in Fresno on the 21st of March. Could you tell us why that was an important thing for you and what you also enjoyed most about that gathering and what we tried to do here in the Valley for Peace and Justice?
Well, thanks, Jim, for having me on your show. I've long admired Peace Fresno. You know, when there are people who are connected to grassroots communities and they're trying to knit together the various strands of activism in their own area and yet also welcome an outsider like myself to come from time to time. I feel very grateful for that. And it was a good event yesterday. It was very well organized.
Now, there were some other things that went on besides yourself, and you alluded in your presentation to how important Rick Reyes' presentation was as one of these vets definitely against the war. Why did you find his message so important and something you wish you had made even a better connection with Rick?
Well, I really do hope to get online and find out more of what he has to say. But, you know, I often say to myself and to others that we need to raise the level of risk that we're willing to take. And, you know, there's never going to be a death squad at my door or, you know, interrogation of my loved ones because I've spoken up or, you know, some risk of a massacre. These kinds of risks happen to people in other countries, often as a consequence of United States military policies. So we should be thinking about Pakistan and Afghanistan and continuing developments in Iraq. But when the soldiers, when they decide to risk a career in the military or punishment or even scorn and derision because they decide to speak honestly about what they've seen and to express their regrets, that's taking a very significant risk. And I'm humbled by that, but I also was very impressed with what Rick Reyes had to say so articulately about his experiences in Afghanistan. And he was challenging us to, you know, recognize, you know, these drone aircraft are astonishing in terms of surveillance capacity. There's no pilot in the drone, it's a robot, but it can fly over the skies and pick up all kinds of information, but they can never tell us about the 850 Afghan children every day that die because of diseases like pneumonia or diarrhea. And they can't really help us understand who are the Taliban or the Al-Qaeda sympathizers in the various different groupings because they don't give us that crucial information. But we really need to revisit the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's Riverside speech given when he, in the Riverside Church, when he talked about going beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. And he said, you have to understand the humanity of your adversary and then try to see ourselves as we're seen by the adversaries. And Rick Reyes was very good at doing that.
He really was. And I'm so glad that they were able to bring in not only yourself, but Rick. And also we had that young Abby Hoffman share with us another time in history, 40 years ago, and what it was to be doing something in your own beloved Chicago. So it's great when an event happens that lets people get energy and direction for their work.
And of course, it was happening in a huge space, and I was thinking, I'm never going to get the attention of people. There's just no way to draw people in. So I decided to to tell an account of something that had happened to me that was a little bit dramatic and required almost, you know, a slight acting, I suppose. But it seemed like that was one way to try to draw people together a bit. And it also gave me a chance to talk about something very real in Afghanistan.
There's actually two forts that came up in your presentation that I'd like you to visit with us. Fort Benning, your protest there, and the aftermath. I think it was very, it was inspiring to me to know from someone who can actually tell you what it's like when you are crossing the line and actually standing up for something. Could you tell us about that experience?
Well, I was going back in memory a little bit. I had come back from Iraq, having been there during the shock and awe bombing, and I felt a strong passion to say I'm ready to confront the United States militarism, and knowing that at this particular Fort Benning, there was training that trains people to go back to their own countries if they've come as a guest of the United States from another country, to enact torture and massacres and disappearances and tremendous usage of threat and fear in order to force people to submit to whatever the sometimes dictatorship or other forms of governance would like to see happen. And this has been documented. This isn't imaginary at all. But also I knew that MPs would be trained at Fort Benning to go over to Iraq. And so I crossed the line, but you know, it wasn't my first time crossing a line carrying a cross or carrying the names of people who've been the victims of these kinds of policies. And so I wasn't really feeling a lot of anxiety, to be honest. It was a bit like going through the airport security at O'Hare Airport in Chicago. You know, I was just, you know what to do next. And so I was sent to Station J. But at that point I was handcuffed, and then they uncuff you in order to search you. But something a bit unusual was that the search was quite aggressive. Orders were being shouted, and there was shoving and squeezing. And so at a certain point, knowing that this same search was going on with people that were nuns and priests, and most of them older than me, I just turned my head to the person that was screaming the orders, and I said, could you help me understand why you're screaming at me? Well, that occasioned a much louder scream and a more aggressive search. And so at one point I decided not to cooperate with it any longer. And I just quietly lowered my arms and said, I'm sorry, I can't cooperate with this anymore. Whoom, I was down on the floor. In a second, I had a black eye from the impact. My wrists were tied, my ankles were tied, my wrists and ankles were tied together. They call it hog-tying someone. And someone who was quite large, about your size, Jim, actually, was kneeling on me, referring to me with an expletive. And I couldn't get a full breath, just wasn't possible. So then I was trying to say, excuse me, you're hurting me, but I can't breathe, and nothing's happening. So I tried again. I'm sorry, but this really hurts. I can't breathe, nothing. So then I tried one more time and mentioned that I'd had a previous lung collapse from congenital diseased tissue. But anyway, that worked, and the guy got off of me. And I got a full breath. But then it was very important to me that as they were carrying me, still hogtied, to the next station, the fellow who was carrying me under my right armpit, when he propped me up, in order to take my picture, they take the things out of your hair. So I look like the Shaggy Dog. The hair is in front of my face. And he said, ma'am, in order to take your picture, I have to remove the hair from in front of your face. Will that be all right? And I said, oh, yeah, that's fine. And then he very gently squeezed my shoulder. He said, I know those cuffs are real tight. We're going to get them off of you as soon as we can. And I needed that. I needed that moment of humanity and kindness. But also, isn't that just how it so often goes? When you just are about ready to give up on some kind of a light at the end of the tunnel or a human touch of kindness, you are reminded that that's there. So it's good for me to remember that particular soldier, but also to realize that at another fort, in Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, soldiers are coming every day from all around the country to train for deployment to Afghanistan and to Iraq. And some of those soldiers are practicing going through a model village and doing just what was done in my case, but on a much larger scale. You know, they burst in, they break down doors, they have to search for weapons, so slit mattresses, empty out cabinets, overturn closets, hog tie, or at least handcuff the men, and sometimes put them in a pickup truck to take them away for interrogation, which could last days or weeks or months. And there's even, I mean, there's a very ghastly story. December 26th of 2009, soldiers were told, you're going into a bomb squad a bomb-making factory. And so they went in, they pulled out the youngsters that were sleeping there, handcuffed them, and shot them all in the head, an execution. And on February 24th, after villagers had raised a hue and cry in the village of Kunar, they said, look, in Afghanistan, they said, these were schoolboys. They were aged 11 to 18. Who can do this? And so the United States military investigated, and then they came out on February 24th of 2010 with an apology. Yes, those were schoolboys. We're sorry. And one neighboring boy was with them who was a shepherd. So we really must keep our eyes on what's happening, because there has been atrocity after atrocity after atrocity in the past year. And we'll hear high military officials issue apologies, and I have no doubt they mean it. But if it happens again and again and again, something goes sour and hollow. And there's where we need leadership in this country to speak up and give guidance and say, this can never happen, but it is the predictable consequence of war.
You mentioned war, and there was a gathering at Fresno State University that was a prayer vigil. And it's only a minute long, but if we could play the clip now that is called "This is War," it may remind us of what Kathy's talking about. It's a brief moment at the university, but let's roll that clip now.
Every minute, 30 children die from lack of food and simple medication. And every minute, $1.3 million of the world's treasury is spent on the military. This is war. For every 100,000 people in the world, there are 800 soldiers, but only 85 doctors. This is war. The amount of money spent in 2 weeks on military expenditures would be enough to provide safe drinking water for the entire world. This is war.
Even in these most horrific of events, we have choice. We can emerge from the flames and we can choose the future. What future will we build to honor these dead? Will we build a future of endless fear, endless revenge? Or will we honor these dead by recommitting ourselves to a future built on these stories of human beauty and communal harmony?
They told me that, unfortunately, we've reached the half point in the program, so we have to take a break. But don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Hello again. I'm visiting with Kathy Kelly, who was the keynote speaker at our Peace and Justice Festival on March 21st here in Fresno. It was a very important day and a great chance for us to see Kathy again, back from having made, as I said, 24 different visits to the Middle East. And we've known that she's been much in Iraq, but also in Jordan with refugees, and also in Gaza quite recently with the people there. And in our second half of the program, we'll be visiting with Kathy over some of those experiences. But I think we should begin with something she told us over the weekend about Afghanistan and about the situation there, which is perhaps not what is covered necessarily in the daily news. This heart-wrenching story of what it is that happens when an oil tanker perhaps becomes not a refuge for the people, but actually a place where they'll all die. Could you narrate that story and how it was turning out to have an effect, especially in Germany?
Mm-hmm. Well, this was in September 4th of 2009. Taliban fighters had hijacked 2 NATO oil tankers. and they were driving them away. And they drove into a bog. They drove into an area where the land was so quagmire-like that the tankers started to sink. There was no way they could push them out, pull them out, and so quite possibly the Taliban hijackers were long gone. That I don't know. But as would happen in any poor area, when there are 2 tankers full of oil and people are so needy for petrol, for fuel, they started running from areas. The locals were coming with containers as large as they could carry, and they were starting to siphon off the oil, thinking, well, we're certainly not going to leave it here. This is a great find. And so it appeared in a German outpost that perhaps there were burgeoning numbers of people that would be a threat to the German outpost because they presumably didn't know about the oil tankers that had sunk. And so the question became, should the German military officer in charge call in a United States airstrike on what might have been a growing number of Taliban fighters? And I guess the German military commander had to make a decision, felt that his primary goal was to safeguard his troops, and so he called in a United States airstrike. And the United States airstrike cost the lives of dozens of people. In one report I'd read 94 people who were locals, they were civilians. Well, the German defense minister on September 6, 2009 went on national German TV and played down the civilian loss of life and asserted that they had it on reliable authority that this was a threat to the German outpost. But what he didn't know is that an F-15 fighter had actually gotten video of the whole thing. And so when the video footage was leaked to the German public was outraged. This is killing of civilians in cold blood who were just obviously trying to get oil. You can't just make those kinds of decisions as though these lives don't matter. And the outcry persisted. And in fact, the German public would not be satisfied until there were actual resignations. And so on November 27th of 2009, Germany's defense minister had to resign. Now, actually, he became the education minister. I'm not sure what to say about that. But along with apologies to the Afghan people, there was also a resignation of 2 top German officials. Now, the reason this stays in my mind is because, I don't speak Pashto or Dari. I'm just reading the New York Times, but I read on a weekly basis accounts of atrocities in which civilians have been killed, and then pretty reliably, a few days later, the apology will come forth. And so, I could recite these, and it's a long list, Jim, but I would just encourage your readers and viewers to stay on top of that matter. But when is the hue and cry going to be raised in our country? Again, that question of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, how are we seen by others? We must be seen as a menacing group of people willing to, with our drone attacks, with our superior air force, attack villages in Afghanistan, and now it's spilling over into Pakistan. It's having an effect in India. We're going to be seen increasingly as a menacing force to be regarded with hatred and fear. But that's not who U.S. people are. So we have to assert that we do not want to be a warlike people who are kind of asleep at the wheel while we're told to be afraid of al-Qaeda that might be. Your Senator Boxer here said in December of 2009, there are maybe 8 dozen al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan, and yet we're spending $2 billion per day on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It costs $1 million to keep 1 U.S. soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year. And we're talking about a country where 60% of the children suffer from malnourishment.
Now, one thing that you are doing so well, especially since 1996 with Voices in the Wilderness, but then especially with Voices for Creative Nonviolence. Maybe we could post that website now. Voices for Creative Nonviolence will be able to let people know a little bit more about you and the efforts that you're doing with others. But could you tell us, Kathy, something about why Voices for Creative Nonviolence could be an alternative to just reading the news, even if it's giving us information, even if it's an apology that's late and a little bit less than it need be? What more can they get at Voices for Creative Nonviolence that might give us some legs, some hands, some real ways of putting our best desires into action like you are?
I think sometimes people can almost feel numbed. They hear so much recitation of the atrocities of war that we stop feeling the sorrow of war. I know that you and I would hear the word My Lai, and we immediately associate that with deep sorrow and regret. And yet it seems like we have the equivalent of those My Lai massacres happening repeatedly. So one thing Voices does is we go. I went to Gaza during the Operation Cast Lead bombing. I was there while the bombs were falling, and it was a horrible time to be there. A bomb exploded once every 11 minutes at night until from 11 at night till 1 in the morning, and then again from 3 until 6. And I was just with one other American. We were allowed in, Audrey Stewart and I, with our counterpunch press passes. But it was important to be there, and then to be with the family that wakes up in the morning, and to go with the students, university students, into Gaza City and to talk with the doctors. You had a strong sense of the sorrow of war, and the sorrow that soldiers also feel, but that many people don't even know what was done to people in Gaza. I mean, they were afflicted for 22 days, from December 27th, 2008 into mid-January 2009, day after day after day of relentless bombing, and so much wreckage and destruction. And they're under siege. I mean, they're under a siege like the siege that was imposed on Iraq. So you can hear about that from those of us who've traveled. Some of us came back from Pakistan, and we really tried our best to write up our accounts of being with the refugees, of being with people who'd been displaced from their homes, whose lives were turned upside down, who had no buffer because they were already very poor. And when you listen to people, you can begin to understand why a young boy whose mother says, yes, you should study the Quran, yes, you should become a strong man, yes, maybe you should join a Taliban group, then they may decide, where am I going to go with my life? I'm so poor. I could work hard all my life long and I'll never get out of debt to the moneylender or to the landlord, and the corrupt courts would never stand up for me or my family. And so sure, they start to join groups that are engaged in armed struggle. And many feel that they're defending themselves against an overwhelming force. Well, I don't agree with it. I want us to hold on to our pacifism as expressed in the New Testament, and to be really grateful that the first 300 years of Christianity really were nonviolent. But if we want to be nonviolent, we have to change our lifestyles. We have to say, okay, how am I going to change my approach to consumption of fossil fuels and other limited sources of energy? Because so much of the war making, so much of the extension of U.S. military might has to do with the pricing and the flow of these energy resources that we want to keep consuming like there's no tomorrow. Well, there might not be for next generations if we don't wake up.
Concretely, what would be something you could tell our viewers, and myself, first one to listen, a concrete action against consumerism, a concrete action in favor of more reverence for the earth, more peace, more justice? What's one or two things, short of going to Gaza and short of being able to do the big thing, give us two things we could do today?
You could go to our website, and you could go to the Peaceable Assembly campaign box. Go to a document called Questions for Legislators. There are 13 questions. Pick one or two and make it your business to pose those two questions to staffers in the senator and in your congressperson and your senator's offices, and say, I want answers to these questions. And you don't want a form letter. You really want a dialogue to be initiated. And then maybe it'll be inconvenient, but figure out when in your schedule you can make an appointment with the elected representative and bring in 6 or 7 people whom you feel would join you in forming a solid group that's going to go in and tell that staffer that you want answers to these questions, and speak credibly because you've studied the issues, at least enough to go inside the office and sit down and have a conversation. And then say you want the staffer to get in touch with the elected representative in Washington, D.C., and you want to have a Skype call, or you want to have a teleconference, or you want to know when exactly they'll be back in town so that you can go to that meeting. This is something concrete that everyone can do. In preparation, maybe write a letter to the editor or submit something to the parish bulletin. But we have so much free speech. Use it. So that's one very concrete thing that we all can do.
Now, there is a clip I'd like to play towards the end of our program now. It comes from this collection of Elfie Ballas. Elfie is the wonderful videographer, director, producer of fine coverage going back to the days of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Worker Movement. Elfie is recovering from his illness. He is present in our group still at the Peace and Justice Festival. The next clip we're going to play is very brief, but it asks the question that we need to hear often. Are you the one? Are you the one? Let's see what Francino Puta is challenging us as she talks to young people at Fresno State University.
Mountains loom before me, and I won't stop now. To stand up and speak out against inequality and injustice. Are you the one? Are you the one? Are you the one?
Kathy, it's been a pleasure having you today for our first program, but don't go away, because we're going to bring on 2 more guests from Peace Fresno to be able to talk more about concrete things we can be doing. I want to thank you for coming and give you one more chance now, last 30 seconds, to let our viewers know why it is we shouldn't accept what's going on, but decide to do something as an alternative voice.
You know, when we look back at how people could have ever sold human beings on auction blocks and engaged in the slave trade, I think we wonder how could they not have caught on that there was another way. I think those of us who are involved in the peace movement, we may find that 100 years from now, people will look back at the people in Peace Fresno and say, thank goodness, at least there were some people who understood what it meant to abolish war.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for watching today, and as I said, we'll be back next week with Kathy. We hope that this has been a provocative program, but not a discouraging one, rather stimulating, leading you to decide with me, we are going to do something to create peace and justice in the Valley. God bless.